We are now in the fourth session of our study in the book of Colossians, and in this session we will be covering chapter 3, verses 1 through 17. Now, before we begin, let me give a very abbreviated review. We find that Paul had learned of the situation that existed in the church in Colossae, and under the inspiration of the Spirit of God had penned the epistle to them. And in essence, in the first two chapters, what he says is this: the fullness of the Godhead is in the person of Christ. Christ is in every believer, therefore every believer has the fullness of God. And because we have the fullness of God by having Christ, don't let anyone judge you in respect to any Judaistic feast and things which are only a shadow of that which was to come, but Christ was the body which cast that shadow, and since he is come, we have no need of those things any longer. And then he says, don't let anyone judge you to be unworthy of a reward in their voluntary humility, or delighting in their humility in the religious activity of angels, because they're puffed up under their fleshly mind and not yielded to the head, who is Christ. And then he says, don't allow anyone to judge you in respect to these ascetic tendencies either, because these things have no value whatsoever against the desires of the flesh. But now in chapter 3 and 4, we find that he's telling us what is manifest in the life of one who is yielded to that fullness of Christ. Being yielded to the fullness of Christ does not result in some kind of an ecstatic utterance or some kind of a foolish experience that people talk about, but it is manifest in our everyday living. Now, notice in chapter 3, verse 1, If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting on the right hand of God. The word if in verse 1 is a first-class conditional clause, which means since. Since ye then were raised. Be risen with is one word, and it's were raised with the Christ. Now, since you were raised with him in your identification with the resurrection of Christ, seek those things which are above. Now, this word seek speaks of the practical striving that we are to have. We're to have a practical striving for the things which are above. Above where? Where Christ is, sitting. The word sitteth is a present participle which renders sitting on the right hand of God. So we are to have a practical striving for the things that are heavenly, not of things upon this earth, such as what we eat or drink, or the feast, and all of those kind of things that are fleshly that man would do. But it's to be a spiritual pursuit for those things which are heavenly, where Christ is sitting on the right hand of God. Then he goes on to say, set your affection on things above. Now notice the words, set your affection on. Here we have the inward impulse and disposition of the person. Now, because of the inward impulse and disposition, then we will seek after the right thing. If we have an inward impulse toward things that are above, then we're going to be practically striving after the things that are above, that are heavenly, rather than things upon the earth. So set your affection on things above, not on things on, or literally upon the earth. Not on things that are upon the earth, but the things which are above, where Christ is sitting on the right hand of the Father. Not on things upon the earth. Why? For ye are dead, or literally, for ye died. That is, you died with Christ when he died on our behalf, and we identified with it. It was the one and the same as if we had died, and your life is hid with Christ in God. Or, better rendered, your life is hidden together with the Christ in the God. Now here we have a statement in reverse of what we've been seeing. We've been seeing the fact that the fullness of the Godhead is in Christ, and Christ is in us, and we have the fullness of God. Here he says, our life is hidden together with Christ in God. So, we're in Christ, Christ is in us, and we are all in Christ in the person of God, in the God or the Godhead. Now, since that is true, he says, when Christ, who is our life, shall appear or shall be manifested, then shall ye also appear or be manifested with him in glory. Now, this word glory, as I stated on one other session, is not a place. Glory is a state or a condition, and basically means an exalted dignity, honor, and reputation. So when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, when he comes to take us to be himself, then we're going to be manifested along with him in an exalted dignity, honor, and reputation. He already has that, and we will be exalted in that. Remember, he made known the mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of the exalted dignity, honor, and reputation. Now, when he comes, we know the reality of that glory, of that exalted dignity, honor, and reputation of being with him. So therefore, since we are in Christ, and we have that promise and that expectation, here's what we should do now in this present life until that takes place. Mortify, therefore, your members which are upon the earth: fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Now, notice here he says to mortify these things. Here, when he says to mortify, that's an old word that the old folk used to use a lot that we don't use today very much. We say, boy, that just kills me. The old folk would say, that mortifies me. We're saying the same thing. Now, the word to mortify means to deaden, to subdue, to bring into subjection various members of our body whereby we may commit certain sins. Now, instead of mentioning the members of our bodies, he mentions the sins which may be committed by various members of our bodies. So we're to count as dead, subdue, bring into subjection the members of our body which are upon the earth, that whereby we may commit these particular sins. Now, what are these sins that he's talking about? First of all, he mentions fornication, or fornication, which is illicit sex. Now, of course, any sex outside of marriage is illicit, whether you're married or whether you're not. It is an illicit relationship. Now, many times the word fornication is used in the Scriptures pertaining to the sexual activity of a single person, whereas adultery is the sexual activity of a married person outside of the marriage. Now, fornication is many times used in reference to either, which is speaking of just an illicit sexual relationship, which is the actual physical act. And then notice these words, they build upon one another. Uncleanness. This word uncleanness speaks of an impurity. It speaks of being morally lewd. It is one thing to commit this illicit sexual activity, but it's far another to be morally lewd with it, and this uncleanness comes from a state of mind. Now, because of the state of mind, then one commits the physical act, and the physical act is committed because of the state of the mind. And then he says inordinate affections, that is, affections that are out of the ordinary. It's lustful, sensual, unrestrained affections. Lustful and sensual, unrestrained affections, affections that you don't hold back. It's a passionate drive which does not rest until it's totally satisfied. In other words, you're never satisfied at all. Affections that you don't hold back, you don't restrain, you feel them, you yield to them. It's what we hear so much about in our modern society today. If it feels good, do it. If a person wants it, they take it and do whatever they want to do. So inordinate affections are lustful, sensual, unrestrained affections, and having a passionate drive for something and never rest. That passionate drive for it does never rest until it's satisfied, and then it's never satisfied because it keeps going for more. Affections that are not restrained. Now, this speaks of the emotional and psychological drive that's within one. Because of that emotional and psychological drive, the state of the mind is set, and out of the mind as a man thinks, so as he comes the actions of life, brings forth the physical act. So the physical act is committed because of a state of mind. The state of mind is set by the emotional and psychological drive. And then he says, evil concupiscence.